Today's reading is taken from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13 to chapter 53, verse 12. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So will many nations be amazed at him, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of a dry ground, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life through an offering of sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear the iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sins of many, and made intercessors for the transgressors. We thank God for his word.
Thank you, Helen. So, the first thing I need to say today is there is not going to be another big announcement at the end of the service. Over the past 2 Sundays, we have had some very significant announcements here and at all our congregations. I haven't been able to be here myself because I've been making those announcements in other congregations. But as you know, a couple of weeks ago, it was announced. This doesn't seem to be responding at the moment. There we go. It's announced that Catherine is leaving to become Archdeacon of Surrey. Michelle taking a post in Cornwall. As we said, David Ritchie also last week, the announcement of his very difficult decision to resign from his post here because of issues of conscience within the Church of England. And even if you weren't present to hear those announcements yourself, if you're on our distribution list, you'll have received emails giving you that information and further information about some of the implications, of course, of 3 full-time ministers all leaving Warfield Church in such a short period of time. That worked. Great. So I have to confess that having to preach on the Sunday following those announcements was a little daunting. Many of us are still processing the news. Many of us are starting to think about what the road ahead looks like, both for us as individuals, for us as a congregation, and for us as the wider group that is Warfield Church. And as I thought about the road ahead and about what to bring this Sunday, I was reminded of a hymn that I used to sing in the Pentecostal church where I grew up. David Ritchie seems to have disappeared from where he was over there, so I'm guessing he's out with the kids at the moment, because I was going to ask him if he remembered this, because he and I share a same heritage of being brought up in the Pentecostal church. But we used to sing this hymn: when the road is rough and steep, fix your eyes upon Jesus. I can see one or two people are nodding. The younger people in the room are not nodding. Let's just put it that way. They're going, what? Never heard this before? It is absolutely true. He alone has power to keep. Fix your eyes upon him. Jesus is a gracious friend, one on whom you can depend. He is faithful to the end. Fix your eyes upon him. Fix your eyes upon Jesus. And so I think the most helpful thing that I can do this morning is to help all of us, in the midst of all the change and uncertainty, to once again fix our eyes on Jesus. I actually think that's the basic calling of everyone who has the privilege of preaching on any Sunday. Little digression, but some of you may have heard of a well-known evangelical Anglican minister called John Stott, who was for many years the rector of that church, All Souls Langham Place in central London. He's well known for his biblical preaching and his writings. And in the pulpit of his church, in such a way that only the preacher could see it and not the congregation, there was a plaque on the pulpit with some words taken from the authorized version of John chapter 12. The story in John chapter 12 is that some Greeks had come to Jerusalem to worship at the Passover. And they sought out one of the disciples of Jesus, and they made this request. As I say, quoting it from the authorized version, the request was, "Sir, we would see Jesus." And John Stott had that on the pulpit in front of him all the time that he was preaching, as a reminder that the task of those of us who preach is to help one another, just to take our eyes off the things around us sometimes and to fix our eyes on Jesus. And so my guess is that you would want to say to me this morning, "Preacher, we would see Jesus." So today, second Sunday of Advent, we heard a few moments ago when we lit the second candle in the Advent crown that the candle today represents the prophets. Those are the people who throughout the period of the Old Testament brought their prophecies and their predictions about the coming of Jesus. There are so many of those prophecies, all given many years before Jesus came, which raised within the people of God this sense of expectation. Someone is coming. Someone known as the Messiah, the Savior. Someone is coming. And so during this season of Advent, we remember how the people of God waited for those promises to be fulfilled. There are so many of them. For a moment, I toyed with the idea of seeing if we could look at all the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus in one sermon. Then I did a little bit of research, found that one man by the name of Alfred Edersheim had written a book called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, and he calculated that there were actually 456 Old Testament verses referring to the Messiah. And I realized that if we worked really quickly and only took about 1 minute to look up and read each verse without me saying anything at all about them, that would take us around 7.5 hours. And my guess was that that would probably stretch your patience to the limit. That I know Advent is about waiting, but waiting 7.5 hours to finish the sermon might not be too attractive for you. So I thought, how can we bring that number down a bit? Then I thought about Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel was primarily written for people from a Jewish background, people who would have been familiar with the Old Testament and with the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. And I know that a number of times in his Gospel, Matthew says, "This happened," and then follows it with a phrase, something like, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet." And so Matthew particularly looks at the prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus. So I thought, let's limit ourselves to these. And I found that there are actually 13 references to those in Matthew's gospel. Well, 13 is infinitely preferable to 456, I'm sure you'll agree. But as I started to look at those 13, I realized that, well, to do them justice, I'd need to spend at least 5 minutes on each of them, and that would be over an hour. So even that was too much, but I wanted you to know about them. So what I've done is to create a little leaflet, which has got all of the references from Matthew's gospel in there, where he says this took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. And in about 35 minutes' time, that will ping into your inbox as an email. So you're not tempted to read it during the sermon, but it will be there long before I've finished. No, long after I've finished. Let me get that the right way round. But there are a few printed copies for anyone who either doesn't have access, isn't on the distribution list, or would have problems printing it out. And it's something I would commend to you as a resource for maybe for your individual Bible study or life group Bible study at some stage. So I decided a far more realistic option is not 456 or even 13, but one. Let's look at one Old Testament prophecy about Jesus, and it's one that is found in the book of the prophet Isaiah. I'll just give you a few facts that you may find interesting. Did you know that there are more passages from the book of Isaiah quoted in the New Testament than from any other Old Testament book? Isaiah gets mentioned more times and quoted more times in the New Testament than any other Old Testament book. Did you know that there is one chapter in Isaiah that is quoted from or alluded to about 85 times in the New Testament? That's just one chapter in Isaiah is quoted about 85 times or referred to or alluded to. Can anyone hazard a guess as to which chapter from the book of Isaiah I'm talking about? There's a bit of a clue, isn't there, in the fact that we had a Bible reading just a few moments ago. That's right. It is, of course, Isaiah 53. 85 times is this chapter referred to or alluded to in the New Testament. So we actually began the Bible reading with the last 3 verses of Isaiah 52, where Isaiah talks about a character that he refers to as my servant. So bearing in mind, and just keep this in your mind all the way through, this was written about 800 years before Jesus came. This was not written after the event describing what happened. This was written about 800 years before Jesus came, prophesying what would happen. And so the fact that this passage is quoted so many times in the New Testament and is applied to Jesus means that I think we can be absolutely confident that the my servant that Isaiah is talking about here is Jesus. This whole section, this whole passage that we read, is written 800 years before Jesus, but is written about Jesus. This is a prophecy about Jesus, who is God's servant. And what Isaiah sort of does really is he starts at the end of the story, because he says about Jesus, he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Well, we can already start to think in terms of what that means, can't we? Jesus, the Gospels tell us the fact that Jesus was raised to life on the 3rd day. He was raised. And then on the day of ascension, both Luke in his Gospel and Luke in Acts tell us that Jesus was taken up. He was lifted up into heaven. And Paul in his letters tells us more than once that Jesus has been exalted to the highest place, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion. He is now highly exalted. But 800 years before any of it happened, Isaiah writes these words and says, my servant, Jesus, will act wisely and he will be raised. He will be lifted up. He will be highly exalted. So here in chapter 52, Isaiah begins at the end of the story, but then in the next chapter, in Isaiah 53, he goes right back to the beginning of the story and tells the whole story of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus in this chapter, Isaiah 53. The whole of Isaiah 53 is about the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, when we think about the life of Jesus, we tend to focus on the 3 years of his ministry and his death and his resurrection. But of course, bear in mind that he had lived quite a long time before that. The Bible tells us he was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. And we can work out the dates that he was probably more in his mid-30s and therefore in his late 30s when he died. So Jesus had a whole life of probably 30 to 35 years before he began his ministry. What was that life like? Well, actually, what we discover is, whilst we focus on the miracles and the parables and all that Jesus did, the life of Jesus before that was what we might call a very ordinary life. Jesus actually lived a very ordinary life. In human terms, there was nothing special about Jesus. It would seem that Jesus was not the classic tall, handsome leader with charisma that people would be drawn to, because Isaiah says he had no majesty to draw us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should be drawn to him. Jesus did not cut a fine figure as a man. He just was an ordinary human being, nothing special to look at. Yes, there were people who became his followers, but the majority of people didn't. Both the religious leaders and the ordinary folk, they didn't follow him. As John puts it in his gospel, he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. We know that Jesus was raised in a poor family. How do we know that? Well, when Mary and Joseph presented Jesus at the temple, they took as their offering 2 birds. And that was the offering that the Old Testament law said you could bring if you were not rich enough to afford a lamb. The offering was meant to be a lamb, but if you couldn't afford a lamb, if you were too poor to afford a lamb, you could bring 2 birds. And when Mary and Joseph presented Jesus, they presented 2 birds. They weren't a rich family. They couldn't afford a lamb. Jesus was raised in a poor family. He wasn't raised among the ruling classes. He wasn't raised amongst the wealthy aristocracy. He was raised in a working class family in Nazareth. Nazareth of all places. Doesn't mean anything to us. We just hear Nazareth. But at the time, Nazareth did not have a good reputation. Remember that there was one person who was called to follow Jesus. Philip went and told Nathanael, "We found the Messiah. It's Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael's reaction was, "Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Nazareth was not a good place to come from. And so we have Jesus, poor, nothing to look at, working class, dodgy background. And tradition has it that Joseph was probably much older than Mary. And the fact that Joseph is hardly mentioned in the Gospels after the opening chapters is taken by some to mean that he probably died while Jesus was quite young. And so it's possible that for some of his life, Jesus knew what it was to be raised in a single-parent family. So the picture isn't quite as glamorous as maybe you would imagine, is it? This is someone who's nothing much to look at, raised in a working-class family in a dodgy town by a single mum. So let's hear again exactly what it is that Isaiah says. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. In fact, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. A very ordinary life, a life of being misunderstood, a life of being rejected, a life where many people thought very little of him. So why does Isaiah tell us all of that? I think part of the reason is this, so that whatever situations we may find ourselves in, however hard we may at times think our situation is, however we may at times feel we have negative experiences, it may feel at times that we too are looked down upon, rejected by people around us. Isaiah tells us this, and it's picked up in the New Testament as well, to make the point Jesus understands. He knows what that feels like. When you're the one who is despised and rejected, when you're the one who's looked down upon for any reason, he knows what it's like. So in those times, we fix our eyes on Jesus, because he knows what it's like to go through what you're going through. You know what it's like. But Isaiah doesn't only speak about the life of Jesus, he also speaks about his death. We know that Jesus died by crucifixion. Crucifixion was not only an exceptionally painful and agonizing way to die, it also carried great shame. It was a form of execution that was reserved only for dangerous criminals or for those from the lower classes like slaves. The Romans invented crucifixion, but it was regarded as so demeaning that no Roman citizen could be crucified. So demeaning was crucifixion that if you were a Roman, you could not be subjected to that form of crucifixion, that form of execution, however badly you had behaved in society. Only the really worst case people were crucified. And that was the Romans, how they saw crucifixion. Paul, when he wrote to the Christians in Galatia, reminds them of an Old Testament statement, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree." And so when people looked at Jesus on the cross, or later when they were told about his death on the cross, then the moment a Roman heard he was crucified on a cross, their thoughts would have been, he must have been a terrible and dangerous criminal. Or if a Jew heard that Jesus had been crucified on a cross, their thoughts would immediately have been, he must have been cursed by God. And Isaiah, writing many years before the death of Jesus, foretold this reaction when he said, "We considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted." But what Isaiah also prophesied is the amazing fact that everything that happened to Jesus on the cross was not because of anything that he had done, but rather because of everything that we have done. Because the death of Jesus was a sacrificial death. Listen again how Isaiah expresses it. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. So we look at this description and we realize it was for us. Isaiah explains why it was necessary. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It was for us. And then Isaiah gives us more accurate descriptions of the death and the burial of Jesus. We haven't got time to go into those. Look them up later. And then at the end he says, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, he had done nothing wrong. There were no charges that could have been brought against him that would have stuck. Nothing that Jesus had ever said or done merited the death penalty. Certainly nothing that justified crucifixion. He had done nothing wrong. But his death, it was for us. And I know that for many of us here, there's been a moment when we moved from just generally acknowledging that Christ died for us to that point where we've been able to say, it was for me. You know that I love the old hymns. I quote them just about every time I preach. I've already quoted one already this morning. Let's have another one. It's a hymn that asks the question, was it for me? And it goes like this. Was it for me? For me alone, the Savior left his glorious throne, the dazzling splendors of the sky. Was it for me he came to die? Was it for me? He bowed his head upon the cross and freely shed his precious blood, that crimson tide. Was it for me the Savior died? And every verse is followed by the chorus that says, it was for me. Yes, all for me. O love of God, so great and free, O wondrous love, I'll shout and sing. He died for me, my Lord and King. So this morning, let me ask you, have you come to the point where you can say, he died for me? I know that it was for me that he died. A few moments ago at the communion table, I used the familiar words of invitation, draw near with faith. Do this in remembrance that Christ died for you. If you take nothing else home with you from this sermon, or indeed from this whole service, let it be this truth, that Christ died for you. His death was a sacrificial death, and it was for you. But Isaiah doesn't end with the death of Jesus, because having spoken about Jesus being despised and rejected and lived a very ordinary life, and having spoken about Jesus being an offering for sin and so a sacrificial death, Isaiah then says about Jesus that God will see his offspring and prolong his days. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. And so the story ends with what our communion liturgy referred to as his mighty resurrection. New Testament tells us that God the Father raised Jesus from the dead. As Isaiah puts it, he saw his offspring. The Father looked at his Son, and he prolonged his days. He raised him to life again, so that now he lives forever. As Isaiah puts it, having suffered and died, Jesus now sees the light of life and is satisfied. Let's just go back to those passages. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. There's something in that phrase that if you were to encounter Jesus the moment he returned to heaven, let's just play with this for a moment in our imaginations. Let's imagine that Jesus has ascended and gone back to heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. And one of the angels sidles up to him and says, Jesus, was it worth it? Was it really worth it to go to earth to become human? Was it really worth it to live an ordinary life? Was it really worth it to be despised and rejected? Was it really worth it to suffer that agonizing death on the cross? Was it really worth it to have everybody pointing at you and assuming that you must be an awful criminal and have done something wrong? Jesus turns to the angel and, in a sense, invites him to look into the years ahead. And he says, look, there in Woodhurst School today, all of those people who now have a relationship with my Father, yes, it was worth it. He shall see the light of life and be satisfied. That he would say it was worth it because it was for us. We are the fruit of his ministry. It was worth it because it was for us. So Isaiah gives us this picture of an ordinary life, a sacrificial death, and a mighty resurrection. And so we come back to where we began. Jesus, God's servant, raised and lifted up and highly exalted, now seated in glory. But there's a couple of other things just as we end. And it says this, just as there were many who were appalled at him, so will many nations be amazed at him. There were many who looked at Jesus. They saw the ordinary life, they saw the crucifixion, and they were appalled at him. Paul says to the Jews, the cross is a stumbling block. To the Greeks, it's foolishness. But to those of us who are being saved, it's the power of God for salvation. But there were many who were appalled at Jesus, could not believe that God would come in human form and suffer such indignity as to be crucified. But 800 years before it happened, Isaiah prophesied, but many nations will be amazed at him. Just as there were many who were appalled, so many will be amazed. So as we come to an end, my final question to us all is this: are we appalled at Jesus, or are we amazed at him? I hope your answer is, I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful. And my song will ever be, how marvelous, how wonderful is my Saviour's love for me. Let's stand and sing that together.